Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Wednesday, February 12th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Good morning.
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you.
Good to have you here. It is day 495 of the war. After a lengthy cabinet meeting Tuesday to discuss the next steps in the stalled ceasefire with Hamas, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that intense fighting would resume in Gaza if hostages were not released by Saturday. We'll discuss the latest in the ongoing ceasefire, President Donald Trump's role in all of it, and how Israel is scrambling to respond. We'll also discuss the White House hosting Jordan's King Abdullah and a few other headlines from yesterday. Stay with us. Okay, Jacob, let's try and update the latest on the hostage talks and the ceasefire, really all of it in the last 24 hours since President Trump gave this deadline of Saturday. And then the Israeli cabinet spent hours yesterday at the Prime Minister's office trying to decide how to respond. And then it gave a sort of response that was as vague as possible. That's what it felt like last night. This morning, no real update in terms of all of it. What are you hearing in terms of the ceasefire, in terms of the hostage release that is supposed to happen in several days?
So I spoke with a senior Israeli official a few hours ago, and the feeling he gave off was just that there's not a lot of clarity about what to expect from Trump. That they weren't expecting his Gaza takeover plan. They weren't expecting this deadline for Saturday at noon for all the hostages to be released. And there's an expectation that there will be further surprises in the coming days and weeks, and trying to figure out how to plan amid those surprises. In the meantime, there's been an amassing of troops on the Gaza border by Israel, like the conscription, the conscripts. And then you also have reservists who are being told to be prepared to be called up en masse to potentially resume fighting as soon as Saturday. Given the deadline that Trump has put forward. I think it was notable that this one Israeli official I spoke with, he said that he thinks Israel might be willing to accept a scenario where Hamas maybe releases just 3 hostages on Saturday as the deal stipulates, and then possibly due to pressure from the Trump administration that maybe it says we'll be releasing additional hostages in the coming days afterwards. But it's unclear whether that will be enough, and whether I think that these will be decisions that Israel won't be making really until Saturday hits. I think the Israeli official also told me that we do need to resume fighting at some point. The scenes coming out of Gaza with the show of force of Hamas is something that we can't accept. And the way that it's starting to really revive itself by charging fees on the aid that's going in, and that can't be ignored. This Israeli official said that he felt that Trump was looking for an excuse to make this ultimatum in which he calls for all the hostages to be released on Saturday. And that Hamas just gave him one by saying a few hours before that ultimatum that it was not going to be releasing those hostages because of alleged Israeli violations of the deal. And I think what the Jerusalem is understanding this ultimatum by Trump is it's basically a green light for it to resume fighting if it wants to. I'm not sure, given Trump does give Israel this out where he says Israel can override me if it wants, but I'm not sure how much Israel is in the interest of trying to take a different path than the one set out by the president, given everyone is trying to not cross him right now. And I think they're scared of maybe if he's saying you can override me if you want, but actually this is what he really wants is for Israel to resume the war. By all the other messaging, then maybe they don't want to test that. I would note, though, that Trump has repeatedly talked about how he was really startled by the images of those 3 hostages who came out on Saturday and how emaciated they looked, and he would compare them to Holocaust survivors. And I think that seems to be what, in my mind, possibly the impetus for this ultimatum, that he's sick and tired of seeing those scenes. And Marco Rubio mentioned that in a recent interview as well, just a few hours ago, and he said that Hamas is breaking the deal, but he didn't really emphasize or explain why that is. And I guess you could say that just the way that it's treating the hostages is the U.S. is interpreting as a violation of the deal. I'm not sure how you're able to exactly do that, but that seems to be the approach the U.S. is taking, where it's just not explaining itself really further. You mentioned the cabinet meeting, and that was, I think, the pinnacle of, I think, a little bit of Israeli scrambling, as you mentioned, how to respond to Trump and whether to fall in line or
Right. I mean, they didn't even give the number of hostages. They were purposely vague about it.
Right. So you had this very traditional Prime Minister Netanyahu strategy of issuing statements from his office in the name of a senior Israeli official. You had one just minutes after the cabinet meeting ended where you had an Israeli official telling reporters this is from Netanyahu's office, saying that they're willing to stick to the hostage deal if Hamas releases the three hostages that it's supposed to on Saturday. Then a few minutes later, you have another statement attributed to a senior Israeli official who says that the entire cabinet backed Trump's demand, i.e. all hostages have to be released Saturday. Then an hour later, you had another senior Israeli official say that the cabinet expects the Hamas to release 9 hostages in the coming days. 9 is the number of hostages of the 33 supposed to be released in the first phase who are still believed to be alive. And it doesn't really get specific about how many days or how long Israel expects for that to take place. And it doesn't say, it claims basically Hamas is violating the deal also without elaborating as to how. And 10 minutes after that, you had Netanyahu himself issue a video statement saying that Israel is prepared to resume fighting until Hamas is defeated if hostages are not released on Saturday. And as you mentioned, there's not a specified number. I think there is an effort. There was an additional statement afterwards saying the cabinet backs Trump's demand. So I guess there's a question of whether this is just totally chaos and Israel not fumbling about what to do and how to respond to Trump, or is it maybe meant to keep Hamas guessing? I think there's also possibly this notion that better to keep things vague and not give a straight answer because there's this attempt to not cross Trump on the one hand and not violate the terms of the deal on the other, because this would be a clear violation of the deal if Israel just decides to resume fighting, assuming Hamas doesn't release those 3 hostages first. So I think there's all these different balls being juggled in there at once, and I think obviously there's Trump's putting a lot of extra wild cards into the game.
Right. But Jacob, you referred to this a little bit earlier, but do you have any sense of what the thoughts are in Washington, in the White House, Trump and his administration, about Israel actually going back in to fight? Calling up reservists, sending enlistees down to the border again. This is a big change in the last weeks and months. This has not been the case on the ground here in Israel. And to, call up the troops again is a huge shift.
Yeah, I think there's been increasingly rhetoric from Trump and those surrounding him, Marco Rubio, and there's a couple interviews he did a few hours ago where there is more and more legitimacy for Israel to resume fighting, be it because of the images of the hostages coming out or possibly because Trump just believes that Hamas is a major obstacle to the Middle East peace deals that he's trying to sign and that better to get him taken out now and then being able to move on to the broader goals of the region. The tricky part is that you're just resuming fighting with a no clear strategy. I spoke to this one senior Israeli official that I mentioned earlier, and he said it's not really clear how the IDF would go about fighting Hamas. The conditions will be a lot more difficult in many ways, given that now you don't have all the Palestinian civilians crowded into one specific area of the humanitarian zone in the south. A lot of people have returned north. On the other hand, there's going to be, I think, less, you could call them handcuffs by the Trump administration in terms of how Israel fights, in terms of whether it's really limiting civilian casualties or whether it's making sure that humanitarian aid gets in. I don't think those are going to be things that the Trump administration is going to be stressing that much. And you've seen the rhetoric coming out of Washington in these past few days where it's really Hamas is fully to blame, not just on the hostage talks issue, which is something that the Biden administration did, but also on the humanitarian front. There's no real blame of Israel. And that's a real shift. And I think it's really going to be up to almost, it seems like things are a little bit on a whim. There's also a lot of the strategy that Trump has taken in terms of the various statements he's made about other conflicts, it's been maybe to try to take a maximalist position and then settle for something a little bit less. And maybe that's what he's looking to get at the end of the day, not actually resume fighting, given that he's talked about trying to end wars, not start them. But obviously we're in a place right now where we're much closer. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is that you had this interesting shift where I think the hostage families viewed Trump as their savior just a few weeks ago, maybe even less than that. And now I think you speak to them and they're really petrified over his call to just resume fighting on Saturday. If all the hostages aren't released, I think the hostage families seem to have a lot more faith in the deal at hand, while recognizing that it's not perfect, as opposed to an expectation that Hamas is just going to release everyone. And on the other hand, you have the far right in Israel, which was massively disappointed in Trump for maybe pushing for a deal, pushing Netanyahu to agree to one and getting that across the finish line. And now they're obviously elated over his plans to clear out Gaza and basically, it seems like, allow Israel to resume fighting.
Yeah. Right. A lot remains to be seen. And honestly, as you were pointing out earlier, every hour, every half hour, it seems to change. So we'll see what today brings. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we're back, we'll talk about Trump hosting King Abdullah and some other headlines. Stay with us. Okay. So King Abdullah at the White House, Jordan's King Abdullah, they had some interesting conversational topics, including taking in injured and ill Palestinian children from Gaza. Tell us what you're hearing about that conversation and, how it really progressed.
Sure. So this meeting took place against the backdrop of Trump's threats just a day before that he's prepared to withhold aid from Egypt and Jordan if it doesn't agree to his demand for them to take in lots and lots of Palestinians, because he has this idea of clearing out Gaza entirely, permanently relocating those who are living there. So I think Jordan is in this very sticky situation where it receives massive amounts of aid from the U.S. and isn't entirely in a position to just say no to that. On the other hand, I do think if push comes to shove that I think they view taking in mass amounts of Palestinians as an existential threat, that they already have a population that's almost half Palestinian, and that there was years and years ago, decades ago, you had this civil war that broke out between some Palestinians and the Hashemite kingdom that was able to be quashed, but it was something that is called Black September, and it's something that really scarred, I guess, the Jordanian historical narrative, and that is not something they want to see repeated again. And among other reasons for not being willing to want to take in Palestinians, I think they view it as really exporting the conflict beyond into their borders, and just doesn't really solve it in the process. So what King Abdullah tries to do, interestingly, is propose something that apparently Trump had no idea was coming, at least that's what he says, and that he's going to take in 2,000 sick Gazan children, people dealing with cancer, and basically it's this gesture to try to maybe meet Trump halfway, when really we're talking about 0.1% of the Gazan population. I'm pretty sure when Trump was talking about Jordan taking in Palestinians,
he didn't mean 2,000.
It was probably a little bit more than that.
Right.
No. And it's a little bit confusing what this really, in terms of sick Palestinian kids, the UAE took in thousands already. I'm not really sure. And specifically cancer survivors, I'm not really sure how many of those exist, but even if you do, it's probably their families as well. So it could be more than 2,000, I guess.
Right.
But still, it's a real hazy offer, and isn't really a shift from Jordan's willingness at all. I think they see just a temporary arrangement of Palestinians in Jordan being permanent. And I think basically, interestingly enough, Trump is loving the idea and says it's so beautiful, it's music to my ears. And I think you have this interesting dynamic where they're trying to push back on his demands for them to take in Palestinians. And Trump again talks about Jordan maybe in front of King Abdullah, in front of reporters. You have this very interesting dynamic that played out differently from the Netanyahu-Trump Oval Office meeting, where they they don't seem to see eye to eye completely. So Trump talks about Jordan has a parcel of land that it can give, and there'll be Palestinians that can live there. And King Abdullah politely tries to say, well, I'm going to have to do what's in my interests, and we're going to have to discuss this with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, who are kind of leading the Arab response to Trump's plan and trying to put something up. But at the same time, he tries to butter Trump up and say, finally, we're seeing someone who can bring stability to the region. And as a result of that, you see Trump rescind his threat and say, maybe we don't need to talk in threats in terms of getting Egypt and Jordan to do what I'd like to do. And it seems like King Abdullah handled the situation pretty well from his standpoint. You don't see Trump to making further demands about. I mean, he does talk about still this parcel of land in Jordan that can be used, but the fact that he rescinds the threat of aid is, I think, something that really was probably very concerning to Amman before this meeting of whether or not this was going, because they even had, I reported about an F-16 shipment of planes that it's trying to get from the U.S., that it's got a payment that's coming up this week that $110 million, that if it doesn't make that payment, there's a fee that's double. And it doesn't have the money to really pay that right now because the U.S. has frozen all foreign military assistance to almost everyone except for Israel and Egypt. So it's in a really difficult situation right now and trying to play its cards very carefully. And I think that was the dynamic that you saw in this meeting.
Jacob, do you have a sense from Trump's administration, from any officials that you speak to, that is there a sense of surprise that the neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, we could add other names in there, that they are not more interested in his idea? Or, this is who their boss is and he throws out ideas and one never knows what's going to stick?
Yeah, I think they're often being led by Trump for sure. I think the point they're trying to make in somewhat, not walking it back, but basically, I mean, somewhat, yes, saying that this is our plan. At the same time, if you guys have another idea, we're happy to listen, but we just don't want you to simply say no. And that was what Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, talked about last week. Marco Rubio talked about it a few hours ago, that we're not shutting down other alternatives, but until you offer one, this is what we're going to be sticking with. This is what the president wants, and we're going to follow his lead on that. And I think that's what we're going to likely see moving forward. I think Egypt announced a few hours ago as well that it's going to be putting out the plan that will hopefully satisfy Trump. And Trump even says during the meeting, I have a pretty good idea of what the plan's going to be, and it's going to be excellent. My understanding is basically that this is a proposal that's broadly the same of what their partners have been talking about for a long time. You have them willing to take part in the post-war reconstruction of Gaza on the condition that the Palestinian Authority is part of that process. But Israel's always ruled that out, so we're kind of back at square one. It's possible that the reform that the PA announced earlier this week might change things. We can talk about that next, but Israel seems to not really be willing to budge.
Right. So you wrote about the Palestinian Authority and this, talking about the fact that it would no longer pay security prisoners and families of slain attackers. Is that official? Is that they are heading toward that direction? What are we really seeing with this statement about it, with this even discussion of it?
Yeah, you're right to be a little bit perplexed by what was announced. It's a little bit complicated. But basically what Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas did on Monday was sign a decree canceling legislation that had to do with the payment of prisoners and security prisoners, their families, and the families of martyrs, they call them, or slain attackers or wounded Palestinians who were carrying out attacks against Israelis. These are people that have been until now were getting paid based off of the length of their sentence, or just if they were involved in an attack and were killed, their families would get money, a flat rate. But the prisoners, which is a larger number, were getting money based off of how severe their crime was. And that was seen as something that's dubbed pay to slay. And it's something that was very much criticized for incentivizing terror. And various U.S. administrations had tried to convince the Palestinian Authority to revoke this legislation in order to possibly open the door to resumed U.S. funding, because in 2018, there was legislation passed called the Taylor Force Act in the United States that basically bans U.S. there was already no funding to the U.S. To the PA directly, but this legislation basically made it even impossible to indirectly support the PA through various other measures in the West Bank.
So what changed now? What's different now?
So I think the timing was quite interesting. There was an understanding, this was something that was already worked on throughout the Biden administration, notably. It was something that they really took seriously in trying to get done. And they basically finalized it. You even had a pilot program quietly taking place that where we saw this shift, where now the PA under this pilot program, and now the decree signs this as well, is that the funds that it gives out as part of its welfare program, because at the end of the day, this is all considered welfare payments. Anyone who receives welfare only is judged and adjudicated the amount that they receive based off of their financial situation and not based off of the amount of money they're getting. So that's what this program does, or this reform does. It doesn't mean that people who are terrorists won't be necessarily getting money. They will only be getting welfare if they are in a poor financial situation, which in the West Bank is for quite a few Palestinians, given the economic state in the West Bank. But it is still significant and something that is exposing Abu Mazen to a ton of criticism from his own, the few supporters that he has left. And I think, as you asked about the timing, I think there was a decision to hold off in announcing it and signing the decree to wait from the Biden administration until the Trump administration do a gesture of goodwill, and try to get on Trump's good side, given how bad relations turned out at the beginning of the first term of Trump. And there was this plan to, at some point during the beginning of the term, to sign this decree. What was surprising is that it happened just days after Trump talks about taking over Gaza and basically what the Palestinians deem as ethnically cleansing all the residents of Gaza. And still you see this announcement from the PA, which it just makes it quite even more shocking. I think it maybe has to do also with the fact that there's a Supreme Court case against the PA and the PLO, which is the international arm, I guess you could say, of the PA, that could expose them to more lawsuits over this program from the victims of terror and U.S. citizens. So I think that was on the horizon as well, and I think maybe this decree is a way to get in front of that. But I think this is more has to do with trying to appease Trump in some way. And obviously it's going to be the proof is going to be in the pudding, and we'll see both the U.S. and Israel have to judge how this program is being implemented. If you're actually seeing a shift in the way that the prisoners are being paid or not paid at all anymore, or if the families of these slain attackers are stopped being paid, if they don't need welfare. Because if you think about it, people in Israel or the U.S. also, if you're in prison, you do get welfare payments. So this idea that anyone who carried out attack, I think, would stop getting money is probably a little bit unrealistic given the current situation in the PA. This is a pretty far-reaching step relatively for what they were able to do. But again, we'll see how they actually play it out. And I think there's going to be a lot of microscopes on how they do so.
Yeah, it all goes into the mix of the news mix right now as well. So we'll keep on seeing what happens with that. All right. Well, thank you, Jacob, for the highlights from the news, the most recent news, and telling us how it's all playing out. So we appreciate it.
Thanks, Jessica.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times Visuals Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Until next time, take care of yourselves and be well. See you soon.